It's the 30th of March 2008 and we're here in San Francisco at the ISA conference, and as part of our Parents of the Field project, we're interviewing our friend and colleague Peter Wallentsteen, who at the moment is at Notre Dame University in Indiana, but is probably better known as one of the most important and probably founder members of the Peace and Conflict program at Uppsala University in Sweden. So Peter, thank you for agreeing at this incredibly early hour to come and talk to us, and we are most grateful for your time and your intention. Peter, we're looking at the early years of the field of peace and conflict studies, and in that particular era Peter came into it from a very different set of background, different set of intellectual discipline, a different set of personal backgrounds. Now, what was yours particularly?
You don't have to answer because you just need to spend 2 or 3 seconds in between questions, please.
Okay. So aside from those personal experiences, what was it that attracted you to working in this field? What sort of drew you in?
Well, we are back to the 1966 period, and I had a double experience, so to say. As a student, I was part of a student exchange program with Poland. And we were exchanging. Poles came to Sweden, I went to Poland. And they brought me to one of the concentration camps, or extermination camps, that I never heard of. It's called Majdanek. It's outside Lublin. And that was the first really confrontation with what the Holocaust was all about. Just seeing a big storage with the shoes of some of the people that were killed. This is a small camp, about 600,000 people were killed. But seeing the shoes of maybe 10,000 people give you an idea of the magnitude. This was an enormous shock. Later went to Auschwitz, but this first experience was a real shock. And it so happened that I had heard about peace research before, I had met Galtung before, and he had invited me to come to Oslo, and right after this I came to Oslo. This is in February 1967. And then I encountered a milieu which made sense out of peace research, because this was a very stimulating milieu. Galtung was a key person, of course, but around him was a whole set of other people in my own age, 21, 22, 23. And there was an idea that, yes, there is something very bad out in this world, but we shall not be cynical, we shall not just look at it, we have to do something about it. And with research we can actually do something about it. So those two experiences made me feel, yes, peace research could actually be something, it could have an impact and a meaning.
So it was that attracted you to working in the field, the idea of research and doing something about it. Was there anything else?
Well, it was a general interest in international affairs, of course. I guess when I look at it later on, I mean, I liked to write, I liked to do research, I liked that approach. And I can see that looking back at done that kind of things before. But just to put that energy, so to say, that was there into peace research, yes, then I would say this double experience was really fundamental in convincing me that this is worthwhile. And as you know, I mean, it didn't exist. There was nothing like this at the universities. And there was only the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. The CIPRI had started to emerge in Stockholm. It published its first things in 1968. So it's very early. And the young crowd that was there was really going into something which nobody really knew what it would look like.
You used the phrase peace research a moment ago, and that was very definitely what the field that you were entering at that time, because my memory of the same period is that I got into a field called conflict research, and sometimes we talk about conflict and peace research, but for you it was very definitely peace research.
Definitely, yes. I mean, that was the name of the institute in Oslo, the Institute for Peace Research. That was the name of the Journal of Peace Research. That was the name of a book that Galtung did at the time in Norwegian, and which was translated into Swedish. It was called Peace Research. But we noticed very early, I mean, coming back from the Oslo experience, there was already before a small group of people, young people, concerned about peace research. And then coming back, I felt, yes, we can do something with this. But then we started this, so to say, institutional struggle. How do we do this? How do you organize it in a university? And then immediately we get the reaction, no, you can't call it peace research. That sounds too naive, it doesn't give the right connotations, you can't really understand wars, it's too complex. So then we came with the idea, I can't remember who, but it should be peace and conflict research. And then all the old people said, yes, that sounds serious. So that's why we have it now as a Department for Peace and Conflict Research.
Okay. So there wasn't, in your mind at least, a clear separation between the two at all?
No. In my mind it was one integrated field, and it's definitely dealt with conflict issues. Conflict resolution perhaps was not a major thing then. It was more causes of war and so on. But on this organizational level, there was an idea to create a Nordic commission or a Nordic committee for peace, for international studies.
Yeah.
And we then struggled to get peace and conflict research into that. So the Nordic Cooperation Committee for International Studies, including conflict and peace research, became the name for this whole thing.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, but for us it was a success, because then our name was in there. It was not just international politics. It was something more than looking at the world in a cynical way.
Okay. Changing the subject slightly. You mentioned that one of the things that interested you was the idea of doing research into problems of peace and problems of conflict. But also, one of the things that started out, I think, in the early days, and perhaps in Scandinavia, was a very strong orientation to practice, to doing something about the problems of peace. How did that work itself out at PRIO in those early days with you and the rest of the group?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to... my being there at PRIO, the setup was basically this, that Galtung was lecturing every week, and all the time new things. But the way he was able to integrate sort of a very theoretical argument into some empirical evidences and then having a political conclusion. He managed to integrate all this into one setting. And I thought that was really the ideal thing. And thinking about it later on, I still think it is a very ingenious way of thinking about how can we as peace researchers then play a role in the politics. We can always, as citizens, have our views. This would be normative. We can write editorial letters and etc., etc. But if we're going to talk as researchers, you need to have that background. You can point to it. Yes, there is a theoretical argument here. There is evidence here. There are articles, etc. And that, I think, provides a different position in which we can enter into the debate.
So, in those early days, do you think there was a definite vision that this new field, whatever it was going to be, would be very distinct from other social science disciplines, or where was the effort going to be made to situate the field as you were developing? Did people have an idea about that, or did it just happen?
What we had there, which existed already from 1966, was something called the unit, the working group, or something for peace research. And it was a very wide variety of things. So there were people from theology interested in the role of church in social change. There were some law people, there was particularly sociologists, quite a lot of sociologists, and some political scientists. So the whole idea was that this would be a broad framework in which we could basically debate, do research, but nobody was thinking of it as a field in which you would write a PhD. You were probably going, and I did myself, write in political science. So I think that idea that you have to do it as, formulate as a discipline, is the only way you can survive in a university structure. Because if you continue to be a forum or a center or some sort, you will be sooner or later completely squeezed out by all the departments, because they are the unit. So somewhere along the line, say 1975, something like that, when we had our first course, we started an undergraduate course in peace and conflict studies. Then the idea comes, no, we have to organize this separately, because the question was, where is this course going to belong? Right. Should it be part of political science or whatever. So the university dynamic, so to say, makes it necessary. And that's my definite conclusion. And my colleagues in Göteborg draw the same conclusion. My colleagues in Lund draw a different conclusion. But we in Uppsala and Göteborg, we draw the conclusion that no, we have to formulate this as a subject. And the only way for a subject to survive in the university is to have a professor. So we had to go for the idea. Nobody was in favor of professor. Nobody was really hierarchical. But that was the survival strategy. So we started to push to get a professor in peace and conflict research.
And the idea was to have it established at the university in Oslo, was it?
No. This we are now in Sweden.
Okay.
So the Norwegians are doing their thing. Actually, they did establish a professor in peace and conflict research, but within sociology, and that is what Galton got in I think, 69. And
so this was back home for you?
So coming back to Sweden, we have this seminar with all these young people, some grey-haired people in there, and one of those who really liked us very much was the rector of the university. He saw some potential there, I suppose. So then the idea is how to survive inside Uppsala University. And how, for my colleagues in Göteborg, how to survive in Göteborg. My colleagues in Lund, how to survive in Lund. So but we went on different strategies. And I would say, looking back, that the strategy of creating a department and having a professor is the one that worked. But it was a big battle. It was a big battle.
I'm sure. I've seen other kinds of battles along those lines as well.
Yeah.
But you succeeded, Gothenburg succeeded. Lund, you say, went in a different direction?
Yeah. They didn't establish it in the same way. They kept to the original idea, in a sense, of being the forum. And they also had an assistant professorship, but that then became, for a while, it was a philosopher who had it, for another while, other people. Right now, the position still exists, but it's within political science. And they have created now a unit within political science, and we of course support them. But they never got the same visibility as we had, and the strength we had by becoming a department.
So, let me just get you to conclude the story. The department and the chair at Uppsala were established, and did you then become the first professor in the department?
Yeah. Okay. So the sequence, 67, coming back from Uppsala to Uppsala from Oslo, we have this seminar going. We have the first course in 75, and then in 79 we convinced the government and the parliament that it should have a plan for the development of peace research at the universities. And in 81 the first position is created, and it's called the Hammarskjöld Chair in Peace and Conflict Research. That's 20 years after Hammarskjöld died. Then we have a big battle how to define this and where should it be. And by 85, I'm appointed in Uppsala. At the same time, my colleagues in Göteborg get a chair, and also appointed in 85. So from 86, you can say, then we could start a PhD program. And that was really the key thing to get. So from 67 to 86, this is 19 years. And it's for me, it's really incredible that it is so difficult to change university structures. I think nobody of us anticipated that it should be this difficult. But the strange thing is, once you have established it, then you are in. Then you are treated as a colleague, and the people even are proud that we are there, and so on and so forth. And now we are part of it. Now we get money in the same way as anybody else, and in fact we are doing reasonably well within the university. But it is like passing through a major threshold, and then suddenly you are established.
Everything is sweetness and light, perhaps.
Yeah.
But you mentioned one thing which I think probably for us is unusual, though we've come across it before in both Denmark and in Norway, which is the role of government in enabling this kind of work to go forward. And if my memory for dates is right, the establishment of Uppsala came well after SIPRI, so there was already SIPRI. But the Swedish government was persuadable about the idea of university programs.
Yes, that's an interesting story. I mean, SIPRI basically emerges because of Pugwash and the Pugwash movement, and the need, as was seen by the Minister of Disarmament at that time, Mrs. Alva Myrdal. She saw a need for an institution like that. And she, being a politically minded woman. She realized that you need to hang it on to some jubilee or something. So here comes 150 years of peace for Sweden. Last war, 1964. So that's when they launched the idea of creating a peace research institute funded by the Ministry of Defense, but autonomous in some sense as a foundation, dealing with armament, disarmament issues. So that's how that is created. But Alva Myrdal, in the report that writes this, she says that there is also room for peace research within the universities. So it seems like you have this SIPRI, which is, when you think about the name, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So it's very international, it speaks English, does not teach, does not train, has very little connection actually to the academic environment in Sweden. It's always been an international director, it's never been a Swede directing it. And so it's living its own life, so to say. But here are all the young people who are interested in peace research. So that becomes politically interesting for the parliamentarians in the area, and they start to push it, and so through the parliament you push the government, you actually get a new government who is education oriented, and then that's how you create it. So what you have in Sweden then today, I would say, is SIPRI with its history, armament oriented, very much focused on technical matters in dialogue with defense and foreign ministries and so on. Then you have the Uppsala department, which is peace and conflict research, causes of war, conflict resolution. Then you have the department in Göteborg, which is peace and development studies, which is much more development focused. So in some way along this we developed some kind of division of labor where one can sort of specialize in one or the other area.
So, but you mentioned a few minutes ago that there was quite a bit of resistance in the universities to the establishment. Was this just sort of the normal university resistance to change, or was there something specific about the Department of Peace Studies?
Yeah, I mean, there was the normal battle between the departments, and the one who felt, for odd reasons, I mean, I was a political scientist, but political science felt somehow threatened and wanted to control this and said this is part of international politics. And we were arguing, no, it's not international politics. This is the study of violence between states, within states. And the political science says, yes, but that's power and that's what we do. And we say, no, we are not interested in power. We want to solve problems. So you have an intellectual battle, an institutional battle. But there is also definitely an opposition to peace as an idea. And we are in the hidden argumentation, so to say. You never see this in papers, but I know what went on. They were saying, no, they are communists, they are soft on communism, and they are, yes, they are, yes, because the Swedish, we are not part of NATO, so that makes the different debate to Norway. But we have this very big military industrial complex. And many of the people, including myself, are conscientious objectors and you know, don't want to take part in the military service. There is the draft, and we are all, some have been to prison. I was given sort of special civilian duties, etc. So we are all under that law, and that is what creates a lot of debate in Sweden about the military and the kind of threats and which ones are really the threats, and you know, how do we deal with the Soviets, which are not far away from us. So it's an important issue. But that was seen as a sort of, we were weakening somehow the Swedish will to defend itself. Those kind of underpinnings were there.
They're not untypical of other places,
no,
of course, but it's interesting that they come through in Sweden as well.
Yes, because I've always found it amazing when people abroad says, of course, in Sweden you have a peace research department. You are so peaceful. But then I remember, you know, it was not easy to establish this. It was not a given, so to say. This was not the government coming saying, no, we shall have this. No, it was us struggling to get it, which I think in many ways is a better way of changing things. I think we, as an institution, have had more impact in Sweden than SIPRI, which is established the other way around, on the public opinion and so on.
Who were some of the major intellectual figures that had an influence on you and on the way you actually approached the field? You've mentioned, I think, Johan, of course, but who else was somebody whose ideas appealed to you and sort of set your thinking along a particular line of research?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Galtung clearly very stimulating as a teacher, very provocative and very creative, I think, particularly in that period, 65 to 72 or something. He wrote a great number of articles which still live on. So to say. Yes. So that was an enormous importance. But for me, there were some others who were important. And one is Bruce Russett. I came to Yale as a student back in '69, and it was Galtung who helped me to connect to Russett. And he was developing what he called the Yale Political Data Program.
Yes, I remember.
So I came there. I also had a contact with Bob North in Stanford, who had a big project on explaining the First World War,
right, yes.
the lateral pressure models. And
That's right. And he was working with Nasli Chukri,
exactly,
if I remember.
Yeah. So I was there, but somehow he was not particularly interested in me, but I was interested in what he was doing. I wrote, actually, this is the style, but I wrote a critique of his whole project, but but he was not interested. This was '69, and there was a lot of student agitation and so on. So but Russett was important, and behind Russett, I realized that there was some other guy who was important. That was Karl Deutsch. And I started to read a lot of Karl Deutsch's things, which are a little like Galtung, very creative, quite imaginative, but maybe not solid research. But security community, these kind of ideas that he had, which has now become sort of political jargon, were really very interesting stuff. So that's a whole set of other influences.
Interesting that they're all American.
These are all Americans, yes. Yeah.
Any homegrown people that influenced you apart from Johan? Any Scandinavians?
Yes.
Anybody from the East?
Yes, good. Well, there is of course the Myrdals, and particularly Alva Myrdal that I mentioned. She had a little more intellectual interest in all these young people who were doing peace research. Just an illustration, I was invited to their home, and there was a lot of people. And Gunnar Myrdal is sort of taking the floor and sitting basically in the corner of the room, and everybody sitting around, and he's saying, oh, well, maybe I should write to Gromyko about this and that. And then in the back are us youngsters sitting, and Alva comes up to us and says, please come along. And we walk out into the next room, and then we sit down with her. I mean, she's a celebrity and so on, but she wants to hear what we are doing. And that was an attitude which I really thought I really learned that. I mean, that is a good attitude for an older person. I mean, she was in her 60s, to try to hear what the young people are thinking. Her husband wanted to tell the world what he was thinking, but she wanted to hear what we were thinking. So I learned a lot from her, and in that sense. So that's the style. Gunnar Myrdal, of course, came with his huge books there on Asian drama and so on. And we were all studying that, but we were sort of a little more on the Marxist line. We were a bit more critical. These books are still good. And his huge book on the American Dilemma is still worthwhile reading. I mean, it is. So it's an intellectual style which few people in Sweden has continued, which is very strange. I should add one more, but that comes in a little later phase. I mean, these are all experiences when I personally try to form, my understanding of what peace research is. But 10 years later, we get a visit from G. David Singer to Uppsala. There was some conference and so on. And he invites me to come to Michigan. So I was in Michigan for a whole series of stays in 80, 81, 82, 84. And so I get to understand the Correlates of War project really from the inside. And I get to hear about his battles and so on around all these experiences. As you say, I mean, it's important to understand what's past. But of course, I, from that, get a bit dissatisfied with the way the Correlates of War project is done. And I tell David, I think this is what I don't like, and he says, well, you do your own thing. Of course, that meant that when he realized, that as I mentioned, the trouble we had with establishing the peace research. He could immediately relate to that, and he was very supportive. He wrote good letters and so on, which made other political scientists in Sweden very angry and said that this is intervention in internal Swedish affairs and things like that. So.
Yankee imperialism.
No, they wouldn't say that.
They wouldn't.
No, they were more US friendly, but sovereignty they could argue, yes.
Okay. So you managed to build up quite a good network of personal contacts, but institutionally, in those days, did you find any conferences or any international organizations useful in extending your network and your ideas? Was there a particular annual conference or a particular meeting place where you and others from Uppsala, eventually Uppsala, got together and were able to at least think that the beginnings of the field were coming?
Yes, and for a number of years Galton ran something he called the Conflict Theory Week, which was a week in January, cold and awful. But,
yes, January.
And I don't know why, but that was another of these, so a lot of Nordic participants. And of course people like Nils Petter Gleditsch, Raimo Väyrynen, and Håkan Wiberg, others were there. And this was his creative period. But for us, I think, at least for myself, it was not just being there and taking notes, but it was establishing a network with other people. So the Nordic setting was important. There was also, and still is, a Nordic Peace Research Conference, and also, I think, basically every second year, biannually, they had these meetings. That was also an important context. And for us, I mean, traveling in the Nordic area was a big thing. Nowadays it's nothing, but then it was a big thing. So that was important. There was also the IPRA, the International Peace Research Association, where some could go. And after a while, we discovered the ISA as an important place as well. So IPSA for a while had the peace and conflict section. No, they closed it down. That's another of these battles, because David and Singer and I was very much involved in trying to defend it, but it was closed down. So yes, all these organizational networks, extremely important, I would say, and it was very good for young people to get a chance, to come, to see, to listen to older, but also test out their own ideas. And that's the way I try to use ISA these days as well. I encourage young people to come. So to this ISA there is, I think, about 18 persons from Uppsala here, and they're all the young people. So it's a good way for them to establish their own new connections and see what field is going.
Further east, did you in those days get much contact? You mentioned going to Poland, which was sort of unusual in those days anyway. But were there any serious efforts made from Sweden to bring in people from what we used to call behind the Iron Curtain?
Yes, indeed. That's right. There was an institute in Vienna, the International Institute for Peace, I think it was called, which organized meetings in Eastern Europe, and particularly in the 70s, when there was a bit more of detente and so on. There was a lot of meetings, which were very interesting to be at. They were often called scholarly meetings, but in reality they were quite political, I would say. Indeed, that meant that we had visitors and so on from Russia, from Poland. I would say mostly more Poland. So that was there, but it's hard to say that it was had a big impact on the kind of research, or had a big intellectual impact. It was more sort of politically significant to be informed, basically, about what they were thinking.
Going on.
The Pagwash framework, of course, also was important. I was part of the Pagwash committee in Sweden. Most of these were natural scientists, but the Pagwash setting was significant. And of course, CIPRI in its construction also had East-West sort of representation in the board. And so on.
What about the rest of Europe? I'm asking this is not on our, but the question that Charles Tenenbaum raised the other day in the round table, about, was there anything in France? And my memory was that almost nothing at all. A little bit in Germany. Hilke Tromp in Groningen.
Right.
But I mean, certainly, I think later the West Germans and then the Germans became interested in peace and peace and conflict. But I think not until the 70s, maybe even the 80s. Is that a wrong view, or have I missed something?
Yeah, I think the Dutch experience is perhaps more significant. There was a guy, an international law person, Bert Röhling,
yes,
who was behind setting up this Institute for Polymerology. And I think that had Hilke Tromp, as you mentioned. So there was a milieu there, or a connection, which sort of disappeared, which is a bit unfortunate.
Yes.
Then there was this Institute for Polymerology in Paris, which, what was his name? Gaston Bouteille.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who was doing sort of studies. And I remember visiting him, it was quite fascinating. He had a sort of fairly French view of conflicts in Africa, and these were sort of children, and they were learning and they were maturing and so on, which was very hard to take. In Germany, Dieter Senghaus, Krippendorf, others, there was, I would say, a stronger Marxist, more hard-nosed Marxist interpretation of the world.
Field's always been characterized as being multidisciplinary. So what key ideas, theories, concepts from other disciplines do you think we've borrowed and used successfully?
Yeah. I mean, I felt that political science was theoryless, so to say. It didn't have much of theorizing. And again, this is an impact from Galtung, I think, which emphasized a lot of theory and very structured thinking. So for me, looking in sociology was really very important. I picked up a lot. This would be people like Simmel and Koser and the whole notion of a conflict theory as some kind of theory. And that, I think, has become very significant to develop some kind of conflict theoretical framework. And we have that in Uppsala. I mentioned also the security community idea, which which came from sort of interaction studies and so on and so forth. That was very important. There was Humans, etc. So there was a lot in sociology. So definitely that was quite important. There was a theory push at that time, which I was reminded that when we talked about it the other day, about the system theory. And David Easton, and that was a way in which political science started to be a little more theoretical. And we, of course, were into that also. And Galtung definitely had the idea of some kind of unified peace theory. That came, I guess, from... I always connected it to physics more. He had studied physics as well. And Einstein had the idea of unified theory of physics. So, but maybe systems theory also was part of Galtung's thinking. It was definitely part of David Singer's thinking. That was very much system thinking. Right?
Yes, you reminded me the other day of Kenneth Boulding's old book, Conflict and Defense, A General Theory.
Yes, that's right.
Which was very definitely put in there for purpose.
Absolutely.
And I think if you look at a lot of the people whose names we've mentioned, you will find them writing very often in the General Systems Yearbook. I mean, Carl Deutsch was writing in that, Kenneth Boulding was writing in that. So around about that time, systems were the wave of the future. It's always rather sad looking back at the waves of the future and wondering what's happened to them. So.
But one thing, I mean, there was not just theory, there was a bit of methodology also. There were ways of doing things which existed in the other disciplines. I'm not sure who invented the fourfold table, but certainly Galtung's thinking was very much a fourfold table, and definitely that is in peace research everywhere. So that as a way of trying to organize concepts and so on and so forth. And I take it as a sort of sociological approach. And after all, he had been studying in Columbia University and so on. He picked this up from the sociologist there. And I don't want to prolong this, but it is interesting. When we created this unit, department or whatever in English, for peace and conflict research, and the chairman of this was the rector of the university, and he was a sociologist. And one of the people who participated was Wallentsteen, who was professor of sociology as well. So sociology had a great ability to appreciate these things. And I think they were also new in sense. And were also feeling that they had difficulties with the existing structures. They were more willing to accommodate. Which the political scientists, when they talk about peace research, they say that is a break away from political science. That's a very negative concept. But the sociologists will say, oh, that's another flower of sociology. So it's an offspring in a nicer way. In Swedish, there are two different words. So, and I noticed the difference in the way one sees it. So, sociology in those days was very broad, and maybe that was the fate of sociology. It became too broad, too many different things. But it was a creative environment, clearly.
Well, you know, you could say the same thing about the sort of broadening out of our own field, the sort of peace and conflict studies field. I mean, if you look at what it's become now, it's sort of broadened out. It's subdivided now into, you know, sort of peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building. You know, we talk about conflict management, conflict transformation, conflict resolution. There's a huge diversity. You know, looking back, do you think this was envisaged at all when we were starting out in the 60s and 70s, that there would be this sort of huge proliferation of studies?
No, I think the whole idea was that it was a fairly unified field and fairly limited. But definitely not. I mean, as I mentioned, in Sweden you have the disarmament studies with CIPRI. You have us doing many of the things that you mentioned. Then you have the people in Göteborg doing much more development and economics, economic history type things. So definitely the field is quite broad. But when I think about it, I've seen it more as maybe this is the way it needs to go, as sort of a division of labor. You concentrate on some things, because in order to really have an impact, you need to have 5, 6 people who are doing the same thing, and then that will generate more and more. And if we are going to have an impact, maybe we can't, you know, all spread ourselves thin, as I think we thought we could earlier, all being sort of encyclopedical Renaissance types, but maybe we have to be a little more specializing, and I think that's where the field is going. And it remains somehow to be able to bring this together so that all the different units can feel that we're actually part of the same field. That might be a problem.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions that came up the other day in the round table from actually one of my former students about where are the boundaries of the field. I mean, everybody I know has terrible difficulty in answering that question.
Right.
You know, Carolyn's was the best answer. You know, focus on the core and leave the periphery to worry about itself, sort of thing.
But it becomes, I mean, my idea from the beginning was that we should have it within the universities for a number of reasons, but not least autonomy and this teaching aspect. But of course that immediately runs into the problem of these departmental divisions. So then you need to somehow specify a field, because otherwise the others will feel, no, you're going to take over what we are doing, and there is this feeling, no, you are imperialist, nice imperialist, but this is actually our field, don't come in here. So the structures, in a sense, forces you to make some kind of delimitation.
Seminal figures in the development of the field, who, in your view, have made major contributions to the development of the way the field has come from early times.
Well, as I myself have been very interested in the causes of war, I would go back quite often to Quincy Wright, Sorokin, the way they did their studies. And I'm running a course on classics of peace research. And the students find it quite interesting to read bits and pieces of what these guys were thinking. So, and you can see that Sorokin, very loose definitions, Wright, a bit better definitions, then Singer, more precision, and Uppsala, even more. So there is a continuous connection there back, which is, I think, quite interesting when you see things as a development. So definitely there is a chain there. The real difficulty, I think, is how to have an impact on the real top level. I mean, how do you really get top decision makers to listen to research in some sense? And we instituted something which I call the TOPS, the top level seminar on peace and conflict studies. And it turned out short, but 11 days was too long, 5 days possibly. You reduce things down to and then it can't really become a meaningful kind of training. So another approach to that has been to try to develop an exchange with the foreign ministry. So they would place people with us, ambassadors and others. And then in return, PhD candidates would be teaching in, or be be in the foreign ministry to learn how the ministry function. That turns out to be extremely difficult to organize, and it has almost to be sort of personal ad hoc arrangement. I wanted an institutional setting to develop that, and even though the foreign ministry was receptive to the idea, it's very hard to bring it about. So there are various attempts here to move forward, so to say, to reach into the not to the more political levels, but it's really hard. It's really hard.
Another characteristic of the field is it's always tried to be practical and applied. It's always actually tried to do something about the real world. Do you think it's been successful in doing that? Do you think it's actually fulfilled that early objective? What impact do you think it's had on the real world of policymakers, on the real world of conflict?
Yeah, no, that's definitely worth a big research project in itself. But I mean, you get these anecdotes. Clearly, Pugwash, for instance, has had an impact on disarmament negotiations, no doubt about it. Do we, dealing more with conflict resolution, do we have an impact? I think so. I think we have had some impact on some of these peace agreements that have been negotiated, and we have been doing things, for instance, on the sanctions issue that really have reformed the sanctions the way they are done, or issues of conflict prevention. Clearly, a number of the ideas that we have developed are part now of the European Union conflict prevention strategy, etc. So, yes, there is. You can find these sort of cases or situations or issues where I think we have had an impact, but it's probably an impact that goes via other people doing it. I mean, it's not really the academics doing it, but those we have taught or those we are consulted by and so on, they may have an impact. And maybe that was a dream in the beginning, that it would be the academic that would be the change agent, him or herself. And I don't think that's the way it works. I mean, academics are, I think, completely hopeless in the political game. The political game is, how to build alliances, make compromises, etc. It's a completely different art than research. And we think that we present our report and we have some conclusions, and then that will go on and live by itself and have an impact. In fact, it doesn't. It has to be carried by some. And then they distort what you said, but they claim you are the responsible one anyway. So that the whole impact dynamics is really very different from what we thought in the beginning, definitely.
But, I mean, I've heard you say on occasions before that, there have been times when people have sort of tried to pull in you or the people from your department to come and solve their problems. And that, I think, was very definitely, at least in Britain, part of the original dream of the academic as practitioner. And you seem to be saying that you don't think that could work.
Yes and no. It has limits. I mean, for instance, when I was called into the Bougainville situation, it was very clearly so. Here is a person, we accept him, he's a professor at university, he's dealing with peace and conflict research. That's fine, that's why we invite him. No vested interest, no particular background, he's from Sweden, Papua New Guinea is here. I know the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Australia, when they heard that a Swedish professor of peace studies or peace research would come and mediate in a conflict in Bougainville, they laughed. But they told me, after a while we stopped laughing. So I take that as a sort of a praise of some sort. So, and I discovered in that situation that a lot of the things I could tell the different parties were things that we know in academics. We know, for instance, how autonomy arrangement can be done. We know how you can create a peacekeeping operation. All that turned out to be extremely practical. And these leaders, they had been part of the invitation, and they were actually listening, and they were taking this in. So definitely, that's a very concrete case. And definitely, what I know was useful for them when we formulated the ceasefire agreements. And we have had similar experiences with East Timor before '99. I mean, we started a secret track with East Timor and Indonesians and East Timorese in 1997, 1998. And that's when we tried to convince them of the idea of autonomy. And then the whole idea of autonomy is brought to the attention of the president of Indonesia, Mr. Habibie. And in an interview with BBC, he says, maybe we could offer you autonomy. Then he destroyed the whole idea, because this was politically not skillful. But he is an engineer, and he maybe had not a really political understanding. So then, of course, the East Timorese says, no, then we want independence. But if you have phrased it in a different way, the whole thing could have developed. And it was too early, but that was a good idea, which the parties, in fact, were willing to entertain, but he destroyed the idea. My colleague, Kjell-Åke Nordqvist, is very much involved in Colombia in various negotiations and so on. But you see that you, in a way, change your role. I mean, you are no longer acting as a professor, you're acting as a person with an academic background, but you have some other skills as well. You are probably, like Kjell-Åke, very good at listening to people, acting in a very, how to say, humble way, etc., etc. And that means the parties get confidence in you. And so on. These are additional things that we are not necessarily training people in. They have that, or they learn it in other circumstances. So, yeah, definitely. When I add all these things up, yes, I think we do have some. We are relevant, and we do have some impact. But it's not really as it was there in the 60s, the feeling that the academics will come in and tell the emperors what to do. No, it doesn't work that way.
Have solution will travel, sort of thing.
Yeah. And that was part of the Galtung experience. He would come down with a very logical solution, and here it is. And just presenting it, and everybody says, yes, of course, that's the solution. But and everybody applauds, and we're happy, and we go home. But of course, the solution does not live by itself. It comes out in a political battle, and the peace researchers are not good at that, not trained for it, and there are too few to count in a democracy.
Well, yes, I think that is a major change from those early days, of course. I think perhaps we've grown older and wiser. But,
Yeah, but we haven't given up. But we I think have to learn a little more. I mean, medicine separates between sort of basic research and clinical research, and maybe that clinical part is not what we have done. Maybe that's something we should do. I mean, how do you actually do things? You have your academic element, but how do you actually do the mediation, or how do you do the preventive actions, etc., etc.
Yeah. Anything that sort of disappointed you, or do you think would have disappointed, the early pioneers in this field? Things that they wanted to do, but they've never been able to achieve?
Maybe we had a bit exaggerated ideas about what you could do as an academic. I mean, that's what we just mentioned. It is more difficult to have an impact on political life than we think. But maybe we can have and have had, I think, more impact on attitudes and so on. We have been part and parcel of a whole shift and change, I would say, where one looks at war in a very different way today, and what role we have played in that one can discuss. But during the Cold War, clearly war was seen as national defense, something very heroic, everybody had to do it. Today, war is seen as a real problem, and it's something that prevents people's development. And there's a basic humanitarian attitude, I would say, at least that's what I see in Scandinavia, maybe Britain, but also in the US. So that's a change, and that attitude change, of course, makes us more relevant, but it also makes us having an impact. There is an audience that listens in a new way, I would say.
Good.
So, but you were asking for sort of failures, rather.
Well, not necessarily. I'm sort of asking for a sort of a balance sheet, so that's a plus.
Yeah, that's a plus. One thing that's surprised me, for instance, we have all these peace research milieus in the Scandinavian countries, but we have no peace research organization for them. And there's always been a resistance to creating one, and that we are cooperating anyway, which I found quite interesting. And we have been, when there have been crises in one, there's often been support from the others, trying to help out, to write letters, or so on and so forth. So it's an interesting form of cooperation that has emerged, which is not really institutionalized. It's not set with secretary generals and things like that. And maybe here is another form of academic support which one maybe should develop. It's always surprised me that when people in universities are arrested and so on, the universities in the north are not shouting about it. But when a journalist is arrested or shot at, all journalists act. I think there is a need to develop some kind of solidarity here. We should be more willing to support academic freedom and so on and so forth around in the world. And that's something which we have been lacking, and maybe we need something there.
So the next step in institutionalization is a sort of globalization of academics and institutions operating in the peace and conflict.
Yeah, some kind of peace research watch, so to say. What happens to peace researchers? And if some of them are, arrested, which happens and so on, we should come and immediately support to make headlines and so on. Yeah, I think we have sort of a self-interest in that. Other things, but these are ideas that we are trying to think about at the Kroc Institute, is all the peace agreements that we now have, which is a really new experience with all these peace agreements. I think really we have had an impact on almost being overwhelmed by it. Suddenly conflict resolution skills became in such a demand, and we were really too few. But what one could have is a peace agreement watch. I mean, how are the agreements treated? Are they implemented? And maybe sound out warnings and so on and so forth. This, John Darby and I have been thinking a little. Can one develop such a function, which would be the same, to say, yes, here is a clever peace agreement, but it's about to fail here because this and that is not happening, and send out some alarms, so to say, so preventive action.
That's an
warnings.
interesting idea.
And I think it's quite doable. It's not a big thing to do, but it could be quite interesting.
That resonates very much with one of my students is doing a piece on Guatemala and the way in which the peace agreement there has been subverted so whereas in El Salvador things seem to have been much better. So maybe a Human Rights Watch for peace agreements or something.
Yeah, exactly. The same idea. But it would be us that will do it. It's not a peace movement, but it would be the peace researcher. We would, come in there with sort of an academic standing, understanding of being without vested interest other than the peace interest, and maybe push for it. Yes,
interesting.
That's an idea.
Looking back over the whole field, well, there's some things that happened that surprised you, that you didn't expect, that was new and startling to you?
Yes. I mean, I just mentioned these new terms that come in. I mean, peace process is a fairly new term. It didn't exist at that time. So we come up with that. Smart sanctions. I mean, one of the first things I worked was on sanctions. And I went back to see what we were thinking, and now we have the notion of smart sanctions. That's something that was a big surprise, but it was a smart way of trying to think about sanctions. That came from Courtwright and Lopez and others who have been looking at it. So these are surprising things that somehow relate to our field, but where one suddenly formulate things in a bit of a new way. Peace building, Galton had the concept back in the 70s, but very loose, and then suddenly peace building becomes a big thing, and it's now post-conflict peace building. Yes. But that's also a term that is generated in the academic, becomes political, but it's also, when it becomes a little more politically relevant, that there is more research on it as well. And so, yes, I see a number of such.
My worry is that sometimes people adopt the language but actually don't really understand what the ramifications of the concept are. So,
I mentioned security community. It is a little like that. I mean, that's a real good term, I think, and it had a very good meaning in what Karl Deutsch was thinking. But of course now it's used for
almost anything.
Almost anything. And that's a problem. I mean, that's a measurement of some degree of success, but that packaging is perhaps the easiest way of having success. You get your term thrown around, but the content is more difficult. And another thing, when I look back, I mean, I think we were thinking about peace research in a very uniform way, globally, so to say. But what has struck me, and I think your project brings this out as well, is how much it has been determined by local conditions. I mean, the Swedish one, very much the disarmament, military-industrial thing. Norway, very much by NATO, EU things. I mean, I think PRIO basically originated. as part of an anti-NATO debate and the way of structuring that debate. Or the US colored very much by Vietnam War, Korean War, and now Iraq War, or India colored very much by the Gandhi experience, Japan colored very much by the nuclear weapons being used on them, etc. So it's quite, or if you go to Africa or Sri Lanka, very much their particular conflicts. So it's really remarkable how the peace research concept then pops up, but in rather different circumstances. And you can say it formulates problems in different ways, but maybe there is some kind of uniform approach behind it. I don't know, some idea that these problems are investigable, possible to go into.
Understand.
Yeah, you can dissect them. Academic methodology can actually help sort things out, and then we can start to do research on it, which are practical in some way.
Yeah. But each has its own sort of local focus and local flavour.
It has, yes, but yes, definitely the agenda becomes very local. But the question is, isn't there something behind that which is more?
So we're back to sort of general theorising, of course.
Yes, maybe there is something behind there still, but maybe on a much higher level of abstraction.
Yes, yeah. Okay, look to the future a little bit. Where do you think there are going to be future lines of development for the field? What can you see happening? I mean, you've already sort of mentioned a couple of interesting concrete proposals, but in general, where are we moving? Where's the next generation going? I was thinking already 10 years ago that environment would be a big thing. And maybe it's gradually coming. So environmental issues, bringing in these kind of sort of completely global understanding. That this is planetary peril, so to say. And that appeals a bit to what peace research is about, thinking in planetary terms. So maybe we'll get more of that. And there is a bit of debate, climate change and conflict, etc., etc. And you can find issues like Darfur, which sort of illustrates at least elements of this climate change. So I think that's perhaps a big field. I thought it would be bigger earlier, but we did some work in the middle of the 90s on water and conflict, and we thought this would be a big field, but it hasn't really turned out. Well, maybe you're
it's
10
there.
years early.
Yeah, maybe we are. Another thing clearly is gender issues, and I think that I think there is perhaps more push in that, because so many of the young people coming in now are women who are very concerned, and a lot of young men who are also very concerned about the gender issues. And I think that's extremely fertile. There is something really very profoundly significant there in the whole gendered power structures, all those terms, which very typical, I mean, during the 90s became sort of ideologized in the way we saw Marxism. But maybe we are now in a phase where reasonable young people are making sense out of this. And I've seen that in Uppsala, a couple of very interesting dissertations. So that, I think, it could be a very strong field. And clearly the composition of the field has changed dramatically. I mean, in the end of the 80s, our students were 75% male. Today they are probably about 70% women. And maybe during the Cold War, the males were interested because this was a lot of technology, weapons, and so on. Even disarmament is actually technology. Whereas now the field is very much peace processes, conflict resolution, mediation. Maybe that appeals more to the women. We have our head of department did a study showing that actually there was a difference in the way women and men choose topics, and the women were much more on that. So that will then also have an impact. The sheer change of the recruitment will make the gender issues more significant. But I think they are intellectually extremely challenging and definitely very fertile for future.
And what about you? What have you got planned for the next few years? What are you working on? What are things that are going to excite you?
I'd like to do more, organizationally, a lot of my time now goes into how to organize the conflict data program. And to make that really, I mean, it's becoming a major source being used in a lot of research, but I need to find a way to make this, institutionalized, so that there is a secure funding. Now it survives on 1 year, 2 year fundings. I think we right now have about 13 different grants and so on. And that takes an enormous amount of time. So that's, institutionally, that's the main thing I'd like to achieve in the next 2 years. And we'll see. Intellectually, I think this concept of peace building is really very interesting, and I think it needs to be looked into more, and I think it is very urgent, because we can see in these conflict patterns how the same conflict reoccur and reoccur.
Right.
And so how do you really build peace building? And that's sort of an intellectual and theoretical problem, but it's also a practical problem. So next week I will go to visit the people in the Peace Building Commission in the UN. So now the term is there, so there is an agency, in a sense, that shall deal with this. I'm curious to see how they deal with it, and I'm quite sure we can really have an impact on them and help them and guide them.
Excellent.
So the peace building issues for me a major thing. And the Kroc Institute, where I'm in the fall semester, is formulating strategic peace building as a key thing they want to work on. And that appealed to me, to try to think a little about what would that be. So that's where I hope to generate some research.
All right. This is one that we always throw at people at the end. If you had been sitting where I am, interviewing somebody such as yourself, what question would you have asked that we haven't asked you? And how would you answer it?
Yes, you haven't asked much about publications and publication strategies. So how do we really bring things out in the world? Which I think has been an important part of the movement. I mean, the Journal of Peace Research, Journal of Conflict Resolution, just two examples. And I think it's still a very urgent problem. How do we really have an impact through the writings that we do? Because there's so many reports of various sorts that are just floating around, and after 2 or 3 years nobody can trace them any longer. And with this new world of Google and so on, one needs to think much more about publication strategies. And of course, what we have talked about here is meeting people, and nowadays it's easier than it was. But a lot of the impact actually was through reading and so on, and learning. And meeting was something you did a little later, and if you were a little older, and so on and so forth. So the whole issue of publications and how peace research actually had to create, in a sense, its own journals and own outlets and so on. I was part of the thing. And now we have security dialogue, we have a little more. There is an idea of doing a journal of conflict prevention, etc., etc. And that, I think, is really very significant, that the peace researchers have established their own journals. And I look at the many other such new things that come up. I mean, all the Marxist studies, where did they go? I mean, they wrote in journals nobody read, except themselves. And then it sort of fizzled out. And I'm wondering sometimes about gender studies. Is that the same thing? It will be just in some few journals. But the peace researchers have managed in an interesting way to do journals which are academically attractive, even for those who are not peace researchers. And that's interesting how that has been possible, and you get these impact factors and things like that. And that's an achievement. So all the people who have devoted a lot of time, like Bruce Russell, Inspector Gleditsch, Galtung in the beginning, to editorial task, that's been a very significant element one tends to forget.
Yes.
That was a question
You
and
take
answer.
it. Well, it's a question and an answer. I guess we sort of tend to take them for granted, don't we?
Yeah.
They're there. But let me sort of push you a bit more on this, something that you said about getting ideas across, because there are various audiences out there, and my experience of civil servants and decision makers is that they don't read Journal of Conflict Resolution. They don't. So, and what they read, tends to, it has to be short, it has to be punchy, it has to be precise.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they don't read it. So, have we done as well?
Probably
on
not.
that level?
No.
Do you think we ought to devote more attention to it?
Yes, definitely. And it's one of the things I've been thinking about. I mean, the world now is so media-driven, in a sense. So we need to learn how to deal with media. And part of that is writing these punchy papers that you say, but it's also being able to talk in a punchy way. These fast sentences. Formulate yourself. I mean, like smart sanctions. that catches on.
Yeah.
You get that concept. So, and I think we are not good at that. No academic is good at that, because this is not what we train people in. We train them to we train them to be thoughtful and reflect and turn things upside down and inside out. And that doesn't work with the media. So here is a real challenge to dealing with the media world and dealing with that need to do the punchy things.
Yeah. Well,
but as the people who research are smart, they should be able to manage this as well.
Well, that's something the next generation will have to do, as far as I'm concerned. Then.
The next generation is probably more into this than we
course,
are. I noticed, yesterday I was at a discussant, and I noticed that these young people are struggling to find punchy titles on their papers. And I actually gave a prize to one who was succeeded. But that's part of an idea now that that's the way we need to do. I mean, our titles, my dissertation was Structure and War on International Relations, 1920, 1968. This is not a selling title, but I don't know about you. But that was the way things were supposed to be.
Yeah.
But now that's no longer good.
No, you're probably